The United States is at war with Iran. Gas prices are climbing. Approval ratings are cratering. The American public is increasingly asking a single question. What are we doing this for, and when does it end? And this week, the President of the United States gave an answer no one in Washington was prepared for. He said he doesn't think about your financial situation, not even a little bit. Let that land for a second, because what came next is where this story gets genuinely complicated and dangerous. Here's what happened. On Tuesday, a reporter asked Trump how much Americans' economic concerns were motivating his push for a peace deal with Iran. His answer was blunt. He said, "Not even a little bit." He continued, "The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran is they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That's all." Within hours, the statement was reverberating across Washington. Republicans scrambled for cover. Democrats sharpened their knives. And somewhere in Tehran, analysts were paying very close attention. This is not just a political story. This is a story about a war, a president's public miscalculation, and the very real question of who has more leverage right now, Washington or Tehran. If you want fast, fact-based coverage of this story without the noise, subscribe now, because this one is moving by the hour. To understand why Tuesday's comment landed the way it did, you need to understand what kind of war this already is. The U.S. military strategy has kept American casualties low, but the primary cost of the war that Americans are feeling is higher gas prices, a direct consequence of the conflict and the U.S. blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. That blockade. Think about what that means in practical terms. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Close it or make it functionally unusable, and oil prices spike globally. Gas stations across the American Midwest, suburbs of Atlanta, neighborhoods in Phoenix, they all feel it at the pump. Americans were already feeling squeezed before this. Trump's economic approval numbers have been falling, and polling shows Americans widely perceive him as neglecting the economy. And into that environment, the President of the United States walked up to a microphone and said the thing out loud that his advisors probably told him never to say. His dismissiveness toward the financial impacts suggested he just didn't care, as if it wasn't even on his radar. CNN's analysis described this as risking sounding particularly tone-deaf. The Republican response was immediate and fractured. While retiring Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina called Trump's comments concerning, Senator John Cornyn of Texas called it just a sort of a throwaway line, and Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming declined to comment, saying mostly she thinks Trump actually does care. House Speaker Mike Johnson and Representative Troy Nehls of Texas fell back on the idea that context might make Trump's comment look better, with Nehls encouraging people to relax. There's an active war with Iran, gas prices are rising, and one of the senior members of Congress is telling constituents to relax. Then came JD Vance. The vice president claimed Wednesday that Trump's comments had been misrepresented, but his own tone was strikingly different from the president's. He said twice that the administration cares about Americans' finances. He swore 3 times that it was focused on the issue. He acknowledged we have a lot of work to do on delivering prosperity and noted the inflation number last month was not great. Read that carefully. The Vice President of the United States, in a single press conference directly contradicted the emotional posture of his own president. Not the policy, the posture, the human acknowledgement that Americans are struggling. CNN's analysis noted it was the kind of nuanced response that plenty in Trump's political operation probably wish the president himself had delivered. But Trump didn't deliver it. And that gap between what Trump said and what Vance immediately had to go clean up reveals something important about where the administration actually is right now. Here's the part most people missed. Trump's comment might not just be a political liability at home. It may have actually weakened America's hand in the war itself. Let's talk strategy, because this is where the story stops being about a gaffe and starts being about power. Wars, especially wars between a democracy and an authoritarian government, are not won purely on the battlefield. They are won or lost based on which side can sustain domestic pain longer. The war and the U.S. blockade are unquestionably causing more economic damage to Iran than to the United States. But the authoritarian government in Tehran is simply not as responsive to public complaints as Washington is. Iran's leadership doesn't face elections. It doesn't need approval ratings. It doesn't hold press conferences where reporters ask why inflation is up. As CNN's analysis put it, this creates a kind of asymmetric warfare where the opposition has a much larger built-in pain tolerance and more leverage because of it. That's the strategic reality. And it existed before Tuesday. But Tuesday made it worse, because here's the contradiction at the heart of Trump's statement. There is a plausible case, the CNN analysis acknowledges, that Trump was deliberately signaling to Tehran that he is not anxious to cut a deal, that he will hold out for his full demands. By saying Americans' finances don't factor in, he could theoretically be projecting resolve. But and this is the critical pivot. There are already multiple data points suggesting Trump is actually quite anxious for a deal to end the war. So he's projecting strength he may not actually have. And Iran knows it. By speaking dismissively about Americans' finances, Trump could actually be hurting his own leverage. If the war is already unpopular and his economic approval rating keeps dropping, his dismissiveness could increase domestic pressure on the president to exit the conflict, which is exactly what Tehran wants. Now add the midterms. If the war drags past the midterms and Democrats gain control of the House, Trump would have to deal with a far less cooperative Congress. So the question isn't just whether Trump's comment was politically damaging. The question is whether it revealed a structural weakness in America's war position, one that Tehran can now calculate and exploit. What do you think? Is this a president projecting strength or a president who just handed Iran a strategic roadmap? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your read on this. Polling already shows Americans broadly don't see the point of this war and don't view it as worth the economic costs. Another poll finds 3/4 of Americans think Trump hasn't paid enough attention to their cost of living. 3/4. That's not a fringe reading. That's the dominant American mood right now. Here's what almost nobody is talking about yet. Trump didn't make the case for this war before it started. He launched it suddenly and then spent weeks backfilling justifications for what he had already done. There was no buildup, no address to the nation laying out the stakes, no sustained public effort to build American buy-in before the first shot was fired, which means the American public was never truly brought along for this ride. And Trump is now trying to hold a war together on public support he never built. That's not just a communications failure, that's a strategic one. Put down the geopolitical chessboard for a moment, because behind all of this, the polling numbers, the congressional gymnastics, the diplomatic leverage calculations, there are real people absorbing real costs. A family in Ohio filling up their tank before a weekend trip, watching the price tick past what they budgeted. A small business owner in Nevada whose delivery costs have climbed since the Strait of Hormuz became a war zone. A single parent in Texas calculating whether they can cover rent, groceries, and gas this month and coming up short. These aren't abstractions. Higher gas prices are the primary cost of the war that Americans are actually feeling at street level. And those prices don't care about your political affiliation. They don't care who you voted for. They show up the same for everyone. The gap between Washington's war calculus and kitchen table America has always existed. But rarely has a sitting president made it this explicit. Rarely has someone in the Oval Office looked into a camera and said, in plain language, that the financial pain of the people he governs isn't part of his thinking. And for millions of Americans, that lands differently depending on where they're standing. For some, it reads as strength, a president so locked onto the nuclear threat that he won't let economic politics cloud his judgment. There's even a version of this where Trump supporters see it as the kind of big-picture thinking that small politicians are too timid to practice. But for others, for the working-class voters who carried Trump into a second term on the promise of economic relief, it sounds like something else entirely. It sounds like the man they elected to fix their lives just told them their lives aren't on his list. Trump is no stranger to dismissive comments about the economic plight of everyday Americans. That's been documented repeatedly. But there's a cumulative effect to these moments. Every time it happens, the emotional distance between the White House and Main Street widens slightly. And this week, it widened publicly, on camera, with a press corps watching. The downstream effects aren't hypothetical. Trump's approval rating on the economy keeps dropping. That's not a trend line that reverses itself through dismissiveness. It reverses through acknowledgement, through visible action, through a president who looks like he's fighting for the people who sent him there. Vance understood that instinctively. His repeated affirmations that the administration cares, his acknowledgement that inflation last month was not great, that was the language of someone trying to rebuild a human connection that had just been severed in a press conference the day before. But Vance is the vice president. He's not the one whose words set the tone. And the tone this week, broadcast globally, clipped on every platform, analyzed in every capital, including Tehran, was, "Your finances don't factor in." There's also a deeper psychological dynamic at work here. When people feel that a war is being fought over their heads, without their buy-in, without their leaders even acknowledging their sacrifice, something changes. Support doesn't just erode, it curdles. It turns into resentment. Americans broadly already don't see the point of this war. Now they've heard the president say he's not thinking about their financial suffering. The combination of those two facts, a war without public conviction, and a president who just said costs don't matter, is not a recipe for sustained national resolve. It's a pressure cooker. The midterms are coming. The economy is the lead issue. No issue looms larger over an election than the economy. If this war is still active by November and gas prices are still elevated and the president's economic approval is still in free fall, the political math for Republicans gets ugly fast. If Democrats gain control of the House, Trump would face a Congress that is far less willing to support his war posture. That's not a distant scenario. That's the runway they're on right now. Meanwhile, every day this drags on is another day Tehran calculates that American political pressure will eventually force Trump's hand, regardless of what he says from a podium. The question isn't just whether Trump can hold out. The question is whether he's already signaled that he can't. Step back from the day's politics. Step back from the polling numbers and the congressional hedging. Look at the structural reality. The United States is in a war with Iran. That war was launched without a sustained public case being built. Trump launched it suddenly and then spent weeks backfilling justifications, almost as if he didn't think he needed to bring the American people along, as if public support were an unnecessary nuisance. That's not just a rhetorical problem, it's a war-fighting problem. Historically, democratic governments that have sustained prolonged military campaigns, think the Gulf War, the Falklands, even the early phase of the Afghanistan conflict, did so because their leaders made the case first. They took their publics through the reasoning. They asked for sacrifice, and they explained what the sacrifice was for. They built the emotional and political infrastructure that allows a democracy to absorb the costs of conflict without fracturing from within. Trump skipped that step, and now he's in the position of fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously, one against Iran's nuclear ambitions and one against his own domestic political collapse. The asymmetry of pain tolerance between a democracy and an authoritarian government is a real and documented strategic disadvantage. It's not new. Analysts and military strategists have written about it for decades. The question is always, can the Democratic side build enough public resolve to outlast it? Right now, that answer looks shaky. 3/4 of Americans think Trump hasn't paid enough attention to the cost of living. A majority don't think the war is worth its economic cost. And the president just confirmed on the record that their cost of living wasn't part of his calculation. Tehran strategists are not asleep. They understand asymmetric pressure. They understand that in a democracy, a president's ability to prosecute a war is ultimately constrained by the electorate. And they will read Tuesday's press conference not as Trump projecting strength, but as Trump revealing vulnerability. A leader whose own party is scrambling to clean up his messaging, whose vice president is publicly contradicting his tone, and whose economic numbers are in sustained decline. The nuclear question remains the stated justification for all of this. Trump's position is singular and unambiguous. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's a legitimate national security concern shared by many governments and analysts across the political spectrum. The argument for preventing nuclear proliferation in a volatile region is not a hard one to make. But Trump didn't make it, not to the American people, not in a sustained, deliberate, prepared way before the war began. And now he's paying the price for that skip. There was an easy way to prevent this. Build the case for the war ahead of time. Lay out discrete and consistent goals, and make sure the American people were bought in and ready to sacrifice personally for the greater good. That didn't happen. What happens next depends on variables that are genuinely unclear. Does Iran read the domestic pressure on Trump and hold firm at the negotiating table? Does the White House find a face-saving off-ramp that allows it to declare victory without fully achieving its stated goals? Do the midterms reshape the political calculus so dramatically that the war becomes untenable? None of those questions have answers today. What we do know is this: a president fighting a war abroad while losing the argument at home is a president in a structurally weakening position. And Tuesday's press conference made that weakness visible to everyone, including the people on the other side of the negotiating table. This story is far from over. This situation is developing fast, and the next few weeks, with midterm pressure mounting and peace talks reportedly stalling, could determine whether this war ends on American terms or Tehran's. What's your read? Did Trump accidentally hand Iran leverage, or is this calculated resolve that the media is misreading? Drop your analysis in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if you want coverage that goes deeper than the headlines, subscribe to the Jang Report. Every major update, every strategic angle, every development that actually matters, we cover it as it happens.